In the summer of 2026, in a quiet corner of the Mexican state of Veracruz, a team of archaeologists was doing what archaeologists usually do, slowly, carefully, brushing away centuries of dirt from a site nobody expected to matter much. No press waiting outside the perimeter tape, no cameras rolling. Just a routine survey ahead of some planned construction. The kind of job that normally ends with a short government filing and nothing else. That is how most of the biggest archaeological discoveries in Mexico's history actually begin. Not with a dramatic expedition into uncharted jungle, but with an ordinary Tuesday that suddenly stops being ordinary. And then their trowels hit something that made every one of them stop talking. A circular stone platform, unlike anything ever recorded in that part of Mexico. And beside it, a monolith almost 2 meters tall, carved with a figure that had unmistakably Maya features. The problem was, this wasn't supposed to be Maya territory. The Maya heartland sits hundreds of kilometers away, deep in the jungles of Yucatan, Chiapas, and Guatemala. Veracruz belonged to other cultures, the Olmec, the Totonac, the Huastec. So why was a Maya-style monument sitting here in a location it had no business being in, built in a style that, according to Mexico's own National Institute of Anthropology and History, had never before been seen anywhere else in the region? Officials didn't downplay it. Mexico's president herself called it highly relevant and immediately committed government resources to investigate and preserve it. When a head of state gets personally involved in a dirt-covered stone circle, you know something doesn't add up. That single find would be enough to build an entire episode around. But here's the unsettling part. This wasn't a one-off. This wasn't Mexico's first strange discovery, and it almost certainly won't be the last. Mexico, it turns out, is one of the most quietly explosive archaeological regions left on Earth. A country where the ground itself seems to be rewriting the textbooks every few years. Where the deeper researchers dig, the less certain we become about how much we actually know about the people who lived there, thousands of years before Columbus, before the Aztec Empire, before even the earliest cities of the Old World reached their peak. Something about Mexican soil keeps producing anomalies that don't fit neatly into the timeline historians have spent over a century constructing. And in the last decade alone, using tools that didn't exist a generation ago, DNA sequencing, laser mapping from orbiting aircraft, and now artificial intelligence sifting through mountains of data, scientists have been forced to quietly rewrite chapter after chapter of what we thought we understood about the ancient Americas. So let's go back. Not to Veracruz, but 50 kilometers northeast of Mexico City, to a place so enormous that when the Aztecs themselves stumbled upon its ruins, centuries after it had been abandoned, they assumed it must have been built by giants or by gods. They called it Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were born. At its peak, somewhere between 100 BC and 750 AD, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities on the entire planet, home to perhaps 100,000 people, its avenues wider than anything in Rome at the time. And yet, here's the part that should stop you cold. We do not know what these people called themselves. We do not know their language. We do not have a single written record of who ruled this metropolis or what they believed. An entire civilization, one of the biggest urban centers in human history at the time it existed, and it left behind no name for itself. That alone should qualify as one of history's stranger mysteries. But it gets stranger. In 2003, a sudden rainstorm caused a sinkhole to open right in front of Teotihuacan's Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent. Archaeologist Sergio Gomez and his team began exploring what turned out to be a sealed tunnel, untouched for roughly 1,800 years. It took them years of painstaking inch-by-inch digging, sometimes removing earth with spades because machinery couldn't be used without risking damage to the structure above. Along the way, they pulled out jade statues, the remains of jaguars, boxes of carved seashells, strange metallic spheres nicknamed disco balls because of how they reflected light, and mirrors made of pyrite, an iron-based mineral that shimmers like gold. Then, in 2015, after 6 years underground, Gomez's team found something that genuinely stunned the scientific community. Pools of liquid mercury sitting at the end of the tunnel in quantities large enough that researchers needed protective equipment just to keep working. Mercury does not occur naturally in liquid pools like this. It has to be extracted through a dangerous, deliberate process from a mineral called cinnabar. This means the people of Teotihuacan possessed the chemical knowledge to isolate and collect a toxic, shimmering liquid metal, and then intentionally placed enormous quantities of it deep underground, inside a sacred tunnel sealed away from the world for nearly 2,000 years. Why would anyone do that? The leading theory is almost poetic. Gomez believes the mercury may have symbolized an underground river or lake, some kind of gateway to the underworld, its rippling silver surface built to represent the shimmering boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. Alongside the mercury, researchers found massive sheets of mica, a mineral known for its reflective and insulating properties, arranged in ways that some later observers have speculated might have amplified the mirror-like effect even further. Walls of the tunnel dusted with powdered pyrite so that, in flickering torchlight, the entire chamber would have seemed to glitter like a field of stars. Whatever the intended meaning, one thing was obvious to everyone who saw it. This chamber, hidden beneath one of the largest pyramids on the continent, was built for something enormously important. Archaeologist George Cowgill, who spent over 4 decades studying Teotihuacan, said the discovery raised the odds that the team was closing in on the first royal tomb ever found at the site, a tomb that, more than 10 years later, has still not been definitively located. The rulers of one of history's great cities remain, to this day, missing. No names, no faces, no confirmed graves, just a lake of poison metal deliberately hidden in the dark, waiting for someone to explain why. Now travel southeast, across the Yucatan Peninsula, to a flooded cave system near the town of Tulum. In 2007, cave divers exploring a network of underwater passageways came across a massive submerged pit, so dark and cavernous they named it Hoyo Negro, the black hole. At the bottom, roughly 40 meters below the surface, they found something extraordinary. A nearly complete human skeleton resting among the bones of saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and other Ice Age creatures that have been extinct for thousands of years. This wasn't just an old skeleton. When scientists finally dated the remains, they found the young woman, whom researchers nicknamed Naya, had died between 12 and 13,000 years ago. At the time, she fell into that pit, most likely while searching for water in what was then a dry cave. Sea levels were dozens of meters lower than today, and the cave wasn't flooded at all. It only filled with water thousands of years later as the Ice Age ended and the oceans rose, sealing Naya's body in an oxygen-poor, mineral-rich environment that preserved her skeleton in astonishing condition, arguably the most complete and genetically intact skeleton of an early American ever found. Here is where the discovery becomes genuinely strange, and where DNA enters the story in the most dramatic way possible. When researchers examined Naya's skull, they found something that didn't match modern Native Americans at all. Her face was narrower, her skull shape closer to populations found today in Africa, Australia, and the Pacific Islands than to any living indigenous group in North or South America. For decades, this kind of mismatch had fueled wild theories about multiple waves of ancient migration from completely different parts of the world. But then scientists extracted actual DNA from Naya's remains, and the genetic results told a very different and far more elegant story. Despite her unfamiliar facial structure, her genetic code linked her directly to the same ancestral population in Beringia, the ancient land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska that gave rise to every Native American population alive today. In other words, the skull said one thing, but the genome said another, and the genome won. It turns out the first Americans simply looked different from their modern descendants, and it was only through thousands of years of evolutionary and social change, possibly linked to shifts in diet, lifestyle, and how populations settled and interbred, that the more familiar facial features of contemporary indigenous Americans gradually emerged. Without ancient DNA extraction technology, a science that barely existed a generation ago, we would still be debating whether Naya represented some vanished, unrelated population, instead of understanding her as a direct ancestor of the people who live across the Americas today. That's a discovery that didn't just answer a question, it rewrote the entire timeline of who reached the Americas first, and it did it using genetic material pulled from a body that had been sitting quietly at the bottom of a flooded cave for 13,000 years. Let's push forward a few thousand years to the peak of Maya civilization, and to a discovery that, on the surface, looks nothing like an archaeological dig at all. It looks like a coincidence born out of a Google search. In 2024, a doctoral student named Luke Auld Thomas was scrolling through old environmental survey data, the kind normally used to track deforestation and carbon levels, when he found a decade-old laser mapping survey, buried on page 16 of his search results, collected years earlier by a Mexican conservation group monitoring the forests of Campeche. On a whim, he decided to reanalyze that old data using the methods archaeologists use to detect buried structures. What the lasers revealed, hiding under the forest canopy this entire time, right next to a modern highway near farmland where people had literally been growing crops in the shadow of these ruins for years without realizing what lay beneath them, was a lost city. Researchers named it Valeriana after a nearby lagoon, and the numbers are almost hard to believe. Nearly 7,000 individual structures. Temple pyramids, a ball court, reservoirs, wide causeways connecting monumental plazas, all the hallmarks of a major classic period. Maya political capital, a city that may have supported between 30 and 50,000 people at its height between roughly 740 and 850 AD, making it more densely populated in its prime than that same region is today. And it had been sitting there the entire time, completely unknown to the Mexican government, completely unknown to the scientific community, hidden not by remoteness or inaccessibility, but simply by thick jungle canopy and the fact that nobody had thought to look at the data the right way. Auld Thomas himself put it bluntly, the scientific community had no idea the city existed. And if a discovery this significant could remain invisible for over a decade, sitting inside data that was already collected and already public, it raises an uncomfortable question. How many more Valerianas are still out there, waiting inside old surveys, old satellite images, old data sets nobody has thought to reanalyze with fresh eyes, or with the kind of AI-assisted pattern recognition that is only now becoming powerful enough to spot the outline of a 2,000-year-old plaza buried under a rainforest? Now, for the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to sit with, because it takes us back to Chichen Itza, arguably the most famous Maya site on Earth, the towering pyramid known as El Castillo, drawing millions of tourists every year. For over a century, historians believed they understood who was sacrificed there. 16th century Spanish accounts, along with skeletal remains dredged from the site's sacred cenote, a massive natural sinkhole believed to be a gateway to the underworld, led researchers to conclude that young women and girls were the primary victims of ritual sacrifice at the site. That assumption held for generations, right up until scientists applied modern DNA sequencing to a mass grave that had actually been discovered decades earlier, in 1967, when archaeologists found the scattered remains of more than 100 children inside an underground cistern near the sacred cenote, a chamber originally built to store fresh water but repurposed at some point into a place for burying sacrificed children. For decades, those remains sat catalogued but not fully understood, because it is notoriously difficult to determine the biological sex of a child's skeleton just by looking at the bones. It took genetic analysis, published in the journal Nature in 2024, to finally settle the question, and the answer overturned everything historians thought they knew. Every single one of the 64 children whose DNA researchers were able to extract was male. Not most, not the majority, all of them. The lead researcher said his team kept rerunning the tests because they simply could not believe the results. But the genetic surprises didn't stop there. When scientists compared the DNA of the different children to one another, they discovered something even more extraordinary, hidden relationships that no visual examination of bones could ever have revealed. 2 separate pairs of the sacrificed boys were identical twins. At least 3 more were full siblings, closely enough related that they too may have been twins, just from separate eggs rather than a single one. Researchers called it the first time genetic science has been able to confidently identify identical twins anywhere in the archaeological record, anywhere in the world. And once you understand Maya mythology, the discovery becomes even more haunting. The Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiche Maya, tells the story of the hero twins, mythological brothers who had descend into the underworld, face trials set by the death gods, and ultimately triumph, becoming celestial bodies. Researchers now believe the Maya were not sacrificing children at random. They appear to have deliberately selected biological twins and close siblings, and offered them together as living recreations of that sacred myth, acting out humanity's oldest story, about death and rebirth using the bodies of real children pulled from local villages near the city. DNA testing further revealed that the sacrificed boys were genetically closely connected to the indigenous Maya families who still live in the region today, in villages, like Tixcacaltuyub, meaning the descendants of these communities are, quite literally, blood relatives of children who were offered to the gods more than 1,000 years ago. A genetic thread stretching unbroken from an underground tomb in the 9th century straight into the present day. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth sitting with before we zoom back out, because it shows that these anomalies aren't confined to pyramids and sacred wells. They show up in the most unassuming places too, in the everyday leftovers of ordinary life. In the town of Zultepec, in the modern state of Tlaxcala, archaeologists spent years excavating a site now called Tehuacán, a name that fittingly translates roughly to the place where they ate them. In the early 1520s, right around the time Hernán Cortés and his men were tearing through central Mexico, a Spanish caravan traveling through the region, along with allied indigenous porters, Cuban colonists, and even a handful of women and children vanished. For decades, this was treated as a footnote, a caravan that simply disappeared into the chaos of conquest. But excavation at Tehuacán told a far more specific and unsettling story. Researchers found human bone fragments scattered across cooking areas, mixed with pottery shards and animal remains, evidence consistent with the local Acolua people capturing the entire caravan, holding some captives for months, and ultimately sacrificing, and, according to the physical evidence at the site, ritually, consuming at least some of the victims over the course of nearly a year, an act of defiance against the invading Spanish that has almost no equivalent documented anywhere else in the historical record of the conquest. It's a stark reminder that the strangeness hiding under Mexican soil isn't limited to the deep, mythic past of pyramids and Mercury lakes. Some of it is astonishingly recent, barely 500 years old, and yet still capable of overturning the story people assumed they already knew. And then there's a category of discovery that runs in the opposite direction, cases where the mystery turns out to be manufactured, not by an ancient civilization, but by more recent human hands, hoping to cash in on our appetite for the unexplained. For over a century, so-called crystal skulls, carved from clear or smoky quartz into eerily lifelike human skulls, were paraded through museums and private collections as relics of Aztec or Maya origin, said to possess mystical energy, said to be evidence of lost technology far beyond what ancient toolmaking should have allowed. Institutions including the Smithsonian and the British Museum eventually subjected several of the most famous specimens to serious scientific analysis, examining the microscopic tool marks left behind during carving. The verdict was unambiguous. The polishing marks were consistent with rotary lapidary tools, wheels, and abrasives that simply did not exist in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, tools that only became available after European contact, most likely in the 19th century. In other words, the crystal skulls almost certainly were not ancient artifacts at all, but elaborate, well-marketed forgeries, created generations after the fall of the Aztec and Maya empires, and sold into the antiquities trade as something they were never meant to be. It's worth including that case here, honestly, because it's the flip side of everything else in this story. Genuine archaeology, the kind backed by DNA sequencing, laser mapping, and rigorous tool mark analysis, doesn't need embellishment. The real discoveries, the Mercury Tunnel, the 13,000-year-old skeleton, the lost city hiding in old survey data, the twin sacrifice confirmed by genetics, are strange enough entirely on their own merits. Science, when it's done carefully, has an almost unfair advantage over myth, because unlike a manufactured legend, the truth tends to keep getting stranger the closer you look at it, rather than falling apart. Put these 5 discoveries side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge that should make anyone rethink how confidently we talk about ancient history. A lake of liquid mercury hidden beneath one of the largest pyramids ever built in the Americas. Its purpose still debated, its royal tomb still missing after more than 20 years of digging. A 13,000-year-old skeleton whose face told archaeologists one story about the peopling of the Americas, while her DNA told a completely different and far more accurate one. An entire lost city, home to tens of thousands of people at its peak, sitting undetected in plain sight for over a millennium, found not through excavation but by accident, buried inside old forestry data. Nobody had both. Arid to look at twice. And a mass grave of sacrificed children that scientists studied for decades without realizing, until genetic sequencing forced the truth into the open, that the victims were not who anyone assumed, and that their deaths were choreographed according to a myth that had survived, whispered, and recorded for over 1,000 years. Every single one of these breakthroughs depended on a technology that either didn't exist or wasn't affordable and precise enough to use until relatively recently. Ancient DNA extraction has only become reliable in the last 15 years or so. LiDAR laser mapping from aircraft has only become cheap and accessible for archaeological reanalysis in roughly the same window. And now artificial intelligence is starting to accelerate both, helping researchers sift through the flood of genetic and spatial data. These tools generate far faster than any human team working by hand ever could. Which brings us back to that circular platform and its lone monolith in Veracruz, discovered just weeks before this story was put together, a monument built in a style researchers openly admit they cannot correlate with anything else ever found in the region. Mexico's government has promised full resources for its investigation and restoration, which means in the coming months and years, we are likely to learn a great deal more about who built it and why. But if the pattern holds, and honestly, at this point, it would be surprising if it didn't, the full answer probably won't come from a shovel alone. It will come from a laboratory extracting genetic material from whatever remains are eventually found nearby. It will come from laser scans, quietly re-examining forest and farmland for kilometers in every direction, searching for the rest of a city that might be hiding beneath crops that have been harvested there for generations. And it will come from researchers running that data through tools capable of spotting patterns the human eye simply cannot catch on its own. There is something almost humbling in all of this. For over 100 years, historians built their picture of ancient Mexico using pottery shards, stone carvings, and the accounts of Spanish conquistadors who often had every reason to distort or diminish the cultures they encountered. That picture was never complete, and in many places, it wasn't even close. It took a sinkhole opening by accident in front of a pyramid, cave divers stumbling into a flooded pit while exploring for entirely different reasons, a graduate student getting bored on page 16 of a search engine, and a laboratory finally capable of reading fragments of ancient bone to reveal even a fraction of what these civilizations actually built, believed, and endured. Which means the discovery in Veracruz almost certainly isn't the end of the story, given how consistently Mexico's soil, jungles, and flooded caves have overturned the historical record every few years for the last 2 decades. The honest answer is that we still don't know how many more of these anomalies are sitting out there right now, undetected, waiting for the right laser scan, the right DNA sample, or the right person to notice a strange shape in an old satellite image everyone else scrolled straight past. The history books, it turns out, were never finished. They were just waiting for someone to dig a little deeper, or in some cases, to stop digging with a shovel at all and start digging through the data instead. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Every one of the discoveries in this story was sitting there the entire time, physically present, waiting. The mercury had been pooled beneath Teotihuacan for 18 centuries before anyone noticed the sinkhole that led to it. Naya had been resting at the bottom of that flooded cave for 13,000 years before a diver's flashlight ever swept across her skull. Valeriana's pyramids had been standing, buried in vegetation, within walking distance of a working highway for over 1,000 years, driven past by commuters who had no idea what was under the trees beside the road. And the true nature of the Chichen Itza sacrifices sat misunderstood in a museum collection for decades, the bones themselves unchanged, waiting only for the science to catch up enough to finally ask them the right question. Nothing about the past changed to produce these revelations. What changed was our capacity to listen to it properly. And if that's true, then the story in Veracruz is less an ending and more an invitation, a reminder that somewhere, beneath the crops, the highways, and the ordinary backyards of modern Mexico, more of these silent, patient artifacts are almost certainly still waiting, in no hurry at all, for the day someone finally points the right instrument in their direction and asks them to speak.